Ahoy! Joe Buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This month, it's going to be Love RPGs, and it's going to be running now all the way through Valentine's Day. So you can get $5 off any order of $25 or more, either online or in person over at Noble Knight Games. Now, there has never been a better time than right now, especially if we're still hanging out at home to pick up some more games to play with our friends and family. So swing on by to nobleknight.com and pump in the code LOVERPGs and get $5 off any order over $25 or more. And don't forget, Noble Knight has a killer trade-in program, so if you've got some older games that you're just not feeling anymore, or if you just need to make some space for some brand new ones, Noble Knight's got you covered. So if you're shopping over at Noble Knight Games between now and Valentine's Day, make sure you use the code LOVERPGs. That's LOVERPGS to get $5 off any order of $25 or more from our friends over at Noble Knight Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the editor-in-chief of Unwinnable.com. He's happy to be talking about a game that actually works, Stu Horvath.
Oh, man. You went there.
I did. No regrets.
Well, we're not going to talk about that seemingly broken and lied about game.
We're going to talk about the other one.
Yeah, the one that doesn't require a television to play.
It certainly won't. So with that, Stu, we're going to talk about Cyberpunk today.
Yeah, Cyberpunk. Totally on everybody's mind lately because of the video game that we're not going to talk about. I swear we're not going to talk about it. But yeah, it's a tabletop role-playing game that has been with us for a very long time. Like Gamma World, this one's sort of a little overdue. And people will be psyched to hear my largely negative opinion of Cyberpunk.
Wow. Just coming in hot off the jump.
I get notes and messages being like, why don't you cover this? Why don't you cover this? Oh, yeah, I'll get to it. And people don't seem to understand that sometimes I'm delaying because I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings.
Yeah.
I mean, Cyberpunk's cool. I like Cyberpunk well enough. But like in terms of the greater spectrum of games, I think there's stuff that does it better. But it's still an interesting game, and we can talk about some stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we're always genuinely trying to take the high road and stay positive and get psyched about the things that you're psyched about. But sometimes, man, it's inevitable. We're going to bum you out a little bit. And this might be one of those times. So, Stu, tell us about Cyberpunk.
So Cyberpunk is the product of Mike Pondsmith and R. Talsorian Games. He is R. Talsorian Games. I never found out why it's called R. Talsorian. It's just one of those mysteries. I always thought it was some sort of shadowy billionaire who was kind of funding it as a kid when it was first coming out. Came out in 1988 was the first edition, riding the wave of the general cyberpunk science fiction movement, which sort of starts in earnest in the late 70s and really kind of comes into its own with the Ridley Scott film Blade Runner, William Gibson's Neuromancer. Neuromancer is the thing that I think really gels everything together in terms of the popular imagination. I think that after Neuromancer comes out in 84, he formed a template that people imitated, and that in turn sort of defines a lot of what we kind of recognize as cyberpunk aesthetics, which is mega corporations. The protagonists tend to be like street level criminal element. Neuromancer, of course, is a heist book at its core. The notion of a interconnected communication platform that we would now recognize as the internet takes on sort of these interesting interpretations pre-internet because people didn't really know what the internet was actually going to be. Those are usually kind of funny.
Well, yeah, because it's wildly speculative at that point.
There's something like a cell phone in 2001: A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke. And I'm not a huge science fiction person, so I'm not speaking with any kind of authority. But I do think that it's interesting that most cyberpunk stuff that I've been exposed to is before the internet and never has a cell phone. You know?
Yeah, well, I mean, back in the day, you have to remember that we lived before the internet. So, like, there's going to be a future generation of people who will just know the internet as the internet, and not that, like, in the 70s and 80s, people are, like, fantasy booking what the internet would ultimately become.
Yeah. It's funny because they do get things right, but, like, nobody saw cell phones coming. Like, this idea of, like, the ubiquitous screen that we all have now, there isn't anything that corresponds to that. When people interface with the internet element, the tubes, the interconnected tubes, they use something called a cyberdeck, and it's basically like a small laptop, what we would kind of equate to a netbook, but it actually plugs into their brain. And like there's this huge, kind of like weird biomechanical aspect of it. And now we have cell phones, and they don't even really have thumb drives. I think that we're living in a cyberpunk universe now, right?
We essentially are, in a lot of ways.
We don't have the flying cars.
Thank God. Thank God. I mean, I could barely get my head around the idea that I exist in a world with self-driving cars.
Ugh.
So flying cars, like, death from the side to side and the front to back on the road, like, I've learned to accept having been driving a car now for, like, over 2 decades, but not death from above.
Yeah, well, did you see the personal helicopters?
No, I don't want to know.
Yeah, I mean, it's as bad as you think. We so desperately need, like, high-tech mass transportation in this country, and then somebody goes and decides freaking personal helicopters. Oh, God.
Yeah, like you think texting and driving is bad. Could you imagine someone who's like texting and flying in their personal helicopter?
I know that's how I'm going to die. Somebody's going to crash their personal helicopter into my house, and then that's going to be it.
Yeah, it feels right.
Yeah.
So anyway, Cyberpunk.
Cyberpunk comes out in 1988. The interesting thing about Cyberpunk, I think, in the broadest sense, is that unlike most Cyberpunk stuff, I feel like there's no way to distinguish like Cyberpunk the genre from Cyberpunk the game because it's the same word, which was very clever on Mike Pondsmith's part.
Yeah.
Which I think is eventually why he gets a big video game made out of it. But unlike most Cyberpunk fiction, there isn't really a connection to Neuromancer, William Gibson, the big cyberpunk novel, because cyberpunk is actually inspired by a different novel by Walter John Williams called Hardwired. And the idea behind Hardwired is, I've never read it, but it's not like a dystopian future where it's like slightly post-apocalyptic. It's very post-apocalyptic. Hardwired is in itself inspired by Roger Zelazny's Damnation Alley, which is like a totally post-nuclear wasteland, and like it's about like a cool tank that's driving cross country. And that's sort of what this one is about. It's about a tank that's controlled by like this punk dude who could like drive and shoot it with his brain.
Wow.
Yeah, because he like plugs his brain into it. It's much more militarized. It's just a lot more.
See, before I knew when the Cyberpunk RPG actually came out, I actually was thinking it was inspired by the Billy Idol album, Cyberpunk. That came out in 1993, and I'm like, wow, that's a weird flex. Hell of a tie-in there.
I think it's the other way around, maybe, unfortunately. God, that album's terrible, isn't it?
Yeah, it was one of the first albums that had an interactive component, but it was only if you had an Apple computer. Like, it came with a disc that you could pop into an Apple computer and like have like a Max Headroom type experience with Billy Idol.
Oh, man.
Yeah, that album tanked. Go on.
Anyway, there's a very different kind of vibe that it comes out of, and I think that makes it very distinct in a way. The first edition comes out in 1988, and it's not really that well supported. There's only 4 books that come out for it. You've got Rocker Boy, which is the source book for the Rocker Boy character class. You've got Solo of Fortune, which is the source book for the Solo class, which is like a merc. And you have a Hardwired source book, which, basically takes the Williams novel and translates it as a setting book sort of for Cyberpunk. And then you have Near Orbit, the space supplement. So like 2013, that's the subtitle for the original Cyberpunk. It was supposed to be 2013, 7 years ago, Hambone.
I know. Oh, man. Nothing that cool happened in 2013, everybody. If you're listening to this in a time capsule somewhere, it wasn't what we were promised.
Yeah. So it's a bit of a mess. It's a bit thin. And there's like kind of a sense in the supporting material that Pondsmith doesn't really know where this was supposed to go or how to nail it down, really. I mean, the rules are fine. They don't really evolve too much between the first edition and the second edition, but there's definitely just like I made the game and now I have rules for space? Seems like a leap to me.
That's a pretty big jump when you have pretty flimsy support leading up to that.
Yeah. And like there's other classes other than Solos and Rocker Boys too. So it's like, where's the cop handbook and the media handbook and the corporate handbook? There's like a natural progression looking back in retrospect, of course.
Well, Stu, in fairness, the corporate handbook is a different kind of role-playing experience.
But he's kind of ahead of the curve because you look back on this, and I could name all of these books that we should probably have done in the first edition of Cyberpunk. But like that's sort of built off of a knowledge of Shadowrun, which comes out in 89, and Vampire the Masquerade with their clan books. Those games sort of established a way to kind of roll out ongoing updates to your game through source books and splat books and that kind of thing. So Pondsmith was sort of out there in 88 with this game that begs for that kind of solution, but didn't have that solution yet, didn't have any kind of inkling because other people hadn't come up with it yet. He was sort of like ahead of the curve and ripe for it, but didn't quite figure it out. And you can see proof of that in the second edition, which comes out in 1990. And it feels more thought out, more cohesive, to me anyway. And I think that part of it is, I think that Shadowrun came out, and I think that Shadowrun kind of clarifies a lot of Pondsmith's thinking about how to approach Cyberpunk. Because Shadowrun has a lot of the same sort of stuff. It has like a hacker class, right? It has the mega corporations. It has some high-tech stuff. It has like an approach. A lot of the stuff, and we talked about this in the Shadowrun episode, there's a lot of stuff, aesthetic stuff that happens in Shadowrun, like formatting their books as if it was like a screen, like you're reading a screen, scrolling up and down, and like it's just a drawing of a scroll bar on the side, but like giving you that feeling that you're looking at this on a computer screen.
Such a cool idea.
It's an awesome idea, and it works so well. I thought when I first started looking into Shadowrun that they ripped that off of Cyberpunk, because that's what the Chromebook supplements for second edition Cyberpunk 2020, that's the layout that they use, that like this is like a digital magazine that you're looking at. But it's the other way around. Shadowrun did it first, and even that idea of like the digital catalog was in the Street Samurai catalog for Shadowrun. And so Pondsmith sort of gets to take the best of the hard cyberpunk ideas that are in Shadowrun and implement them into his game. And then all of a sudden, I feel like Cyberpunk A becomes a lot more in line with the Gibson sort of version of Shadowpunk, which Pondsmith says that he didn't read until much later. And I think that you could tell in the 2013 book that this does not come from Gibson. I think that it feels strange because of that, because it comes from this Hardwired novel. But now, after 2020 comes out, and that's the second edition, is 2020. Living through 2020 just this past year is...
Too soon.
I wish I got a little Chrome in 2020, but I didn't. You know, I think that all of that kind of comes together. I feel like Pondsmith gets his Gibson obliquely by sort of traveling through other cyberpunk role-playing games. And by implementing stuff from those games, he kind of gets more and more of the Gibson influence. So it's a skill-based system, so, you know, that makes me like it. No levels. There's some tenets to the game. The first one is style over substance, which is a very 1980s mentality. It's taken to sort of like almost the level of parody in Cyberpunk. The idea of substance is just mocked throughout the books because there's just such a emphasis on disposability. And thematically, it's a dystopia. There's mega corporations. There's this crushing economy. The poor are so dirt poor, they're never going to not be poor. Everybody who's not in the corporations is basically a criminal living like some sort of violent existence. There's this whole dichotomy between like you need more cyber stuff, hardware, chrome, whatever you want to call it, to kind of interface with society. But the more you get, the less human you are. And there's like transhumanism.
So oddly prophetic.
Sort of in a way, but like...
For what 2020 actually is in the state of the world and how we are. Like, yeah, you had the flash and bang of the 80s where, like, it really was more style over substance. However, a lot of things that have endured since the 80s would have drawn you in with that style and gotten you to stick around for the substance. To me, this sounds like one of those things. Oddly, though, man, calling the shot from back then, that is not feeling too awesome.
So the other two sort of tenets or pillars of Cyberpunk are going to clarify this a little bit for you. Number 2 is attitude is everything, which makes it a lot more like aggressive and focuses more on self-centered behavior. So greed is a big modifier. And the third tenet is always take it to the edge. And that's sort of where it all falls apart for me.
So basically Mike Pondsmith invented YOLO.
Sort of.
Call the shot back in the day. Is he like loosely related to Nostradamus? Like our friend Dave is like loosely related to John Wilkes Booth? Because everything that you're telling me right now is not really proving me otherwise.
Yeah. But that edge thing, Cyberpunk is sort of like the first tabletop role-playing game, in my opinion, that kind of starts to really embrace the idea of what we call now edgelords. But like, it's true, dude.
Oh.
Because it's dystopian and it's cynical and it's just style over substance. Like, there's no room for idealism in the Cyberpunk universe. And like, that's why I kind of can't get into it. Cyberpunk doesn't feel political. It's sort of actively trying to be like non-political. It's just like, yeah, we're here to blow stuff up and like shoot at each other and like steal stuff. It takes like a very D&D sort of murder hobo attitude, transplants it to the future, and like wraps it in like this sort of setting that's like a rich ripeness for social commentary, and then just discards it, doesn't care about it. That's why I'm sort of drawn more to Shadowrun or Underground, because there is a inherent kind of belief in positive change in those games.
Yeah, no, you're right. Shadowrun is UK punk and Cyberpunk is American punk. Style over substance versus, you know, the working class trying to get shit done.
Yeah. I don't want it to sound like I'm saying that like Cyberpunk is bad. I was never on that vibe. I always think that it's better to kind of like believe in something and to have games where you foster different beliefs than to not. And Cyberpunk is really about not. It's about like getting kitted out and like being awesome and not dying. And the not dying part is really hard because the combat system is really deadly.
Now, does that evolve through the years, though? The idea of all I want is nothing to potentially now, maybe with the latest edition, there's a little more optimism and hope in it?
I do own Cyberpunk Red. I haven't read it yet, though. I got it for Christmas.
So that means there'll be a future episode for you.
Yeah, and I think that definitely warrants its own episode, if nothing else, for that question, Hambone. But I do think that there's a shift. I think that players just generally want a little bit more, like not explicitly from their games, but like potentially from their games. And I think that's sort of the problem that Pondsmith ran into initially with 2013, was that he created this game that was style over substance. Attitude is everything. And like, that only takes you so far. Why bother putting out more source books? Because all the characters are going to die, you know? So like, it robs you of motivation to do more, I think, kind of on a philosophical level. And I think that might be what he ran into. There's great stuff in Cyberpunk. The Night City source book is one of the best city source books ever written, I think. And it does like a really good job of like providing you with a playground. That's a second edition book. And there's nothing to say that you can't inject your own sense of optimism into Cyberpunk, but I do think that the system is sort of built against you just mechanically because it's such a squishy kind of system. The Friday Night Firefight combat system is extremely deadly. Like like even the toughest dudes that are built like tanks can like walk into a bullet and just drop in Cyberpunk combat. And that's sort of at odds with this really interesting character creation system that they have where you roll up your background. Like there's a little bit of a personal history generation, which I think is so cool and narrative sort of like friendly, but then like you marry that to a system. And I mean, I guess that's not too different from Pendragon, where there's like all that family history that you roll up, but then like, you know, you take the wrong sword swing and poof, you know, your head explodes.
That's it. Don't take much in Pendragon.
But I think that there's also reasons to live in Pendragon, whereas Cyberpunk is just like, there aren't. You're just trying to get yours before you die, is my kind of takeaway from Cyberpunk. That's just not the kind of game that I want to gather around with my friends and play on a Friday night.
Yeah, you know, nothing like a Friday night nihilism session to really get you ready for the weekend.
It's very nihilistic. And like most of us don't drink anymore, so it's like we can't even like drown ourselves. Man, that Cyberpunk game was so nihilistic. Let me have a shot of whiskey. It's like I don't even have that option anymore. I just got to go to bed and stare at my ceiling.
Yeah, looking forward to that 2 tabs of Alka-Seltzer I'm going to drop and that slow shift into slumber. So with that, Stu, do you have any final thoughts on Cyberpunk?
Cyberpunk is cool, man. But like there's also stuff out there that's kind of cooler. Like, I don't know. Don't be jaded and cynical. It's not worth it. I spent long periods of my life just being angry at stuff, and it's better to not. Just like kind of try and find the positive thing and affect change that, you know, makes you happy. Cyberpunk isn't about those things.
It sounds like you're taking the Shadowrun outlook into Cyberpunk.
That's the funny thing. I vastly prefer Cyberpunk's system over Shadowrun. I think that Shadowrun is too complicated for me. At the core, Shadowrun has like a warmer heart, and I like the heart more. If you're looking for an ice-cold role-playing game, Cyberpunk's for you, man. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of sleek, like going in, going out. I want to knock over a corporation, have a heist, You know, maybe like have a gunfight spill out into the streets, like have everybody die at the end. Like Heat, go for it. Cyberpunk is your system. I don't want to play that game. That's just me.
Well, with that, we are definitely going to do another episode down the line about the brand new Cyberpunk that we've both heard really great things about. So we're definitely going to review that once Stu actually reads the book, because we are not too far removed from Christmas, and I've seen the stack of books he had to get to first.
I'm writing a book. I don't have any time to read books, Hambone.
There is also that. And folks, if you're interested in hearing more about Stu's book, you can check out our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg. You get an early behind-the-scenes look at some of the stuff that's happening with Stu's book. You get an early look at my upcoming RPG 321 action. You also get access to our Patreon-only Discord. You also get some other cool things as well, and we have a killer community over on Discord, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. Patreon.com/vintagerpg. So now that I got that pitch out of the way, I will say this has been another awesome episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me on Instagram at VintageRPG, posting about role-playing games like Cyberpunk every day of the week.
You can find me on the Twitter at Handbreaker. I tweet about board games. I tweet about cute animals. I tweet about Dungeons & Dragons. You can follow my day-to-day adventures in podcasting and in life over on Instagram at Sean Hambone McGuire. If you are a fan of the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe, because your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dego West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.